Thank you very much, Declan, and also to Hannah for the invitation to come and speak to you all here today. This is a really exciting event with lots of great material, so hopefully I can make a meaningful contribution to it myself. So going straight in, if I can get this to work. No, it's not advancing. I need some help here. Maybe I just have to do it here. There we go. Okay. Not plugged in. Okay, great. Thank you. Hopefully that's the only technical hitch. So, just before moving to Scotland, I wanted to take a step a bit wider out because I think big. And I'd like to invite you to think big too. You've probably all seen this photograph before, taken by Apollo astronauts in the late 60s. Our planet from space, the beautiful blue and white orb that we live on. How many of you have noticed something I noticed quite a few years ago? The most prominent feature about this are brown areas of land, desertified land. 2,000 years ago, the top of that picture, North Africa, was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Big forests flourished there, and animals like the Barbary lion and the Atlas bear lived there, both now extinct. So we live in a world whose capacity to support life has been drastically reduced in the last 2,000 years, particularly the last 200 years, and that is accelerating at the moment. It's invisible to most of us because we don't see it on a day-by-day basis. I grew up in Scotland thinking this was the natural state of affairs because I wasn't around 2,000 years ago when the land was covered in trees. And it's only in the last 30, 35 years when I moved to the Highlands and began spending time in these glens that I came to understand and realize that this is actually a ruined landscape. And when we look carefully at any glen in the Highlands of Scotland today, you can see the evidence of what we've lost. You can see the snags, the standing dead skeletons of Scots pines. You can see the stumps of the pines that flourished thousands of years ago where the peat has been eroded. And it's not just the trees that have gone. With the trees, all the wildlife that used to live there, so most of our large mammal species are nationally extinct now, and the people have gone too. We had an event in the Highlands in the 18th century called the Highland Clearances, when tenant crofters were forced off the land by landowners and were replaced by large quantities of sheep. And today, sheep still outnumber people in Scotland. And I say, sometimes only half-jokingly, Scotland is a nation of sheep because we've allowed ourselves to be pushed around so much in the past. So sheep and deer have proliferated. They've taken over the landscape. And we'll come on to that in a few moments. This is what Scotland, the Highlands, would have looked like almost exclusively in the past. The vast majority of the land would have been covered by trees. The Caledonian forest characterized by Scots pine with a range of broadleaf trees. Here you see the birches in autumn. And underneath, a rich understory, heather, blaeberry, which I think you call bilberry here, and many other plant species thriving under the canopy of the trees. So coming on to the subject a bit more, just to draw some parallels, we heard earlier today that Scots pine is native to Ireland and has been continuously present in the country, contrary to what might have been thought before. But more today, there's not so much Scots pine, but you've got a lot more oak. And if you look at these two pictures here, you can see the great similarities between Killarney and Glastrum Wood, which is in Loch Aber in Scotland. Remnants of the temperate rainforest, the so-called Celtic rainforest. Another picture from Killarney here on the right, and very similar to what we see in northwest Scotland, the Scowrie Peninsula in Sutherland, where the hills are largely treeless, but if you find a few islands in little lochs, they're covered in forest because the deer don't get there. So we have many things in common. And we've also heard today about non-native invasive species, rhododendron. We've got it in Scotland too, quite badly in the west coast. Problems with other non-natives, and the same thing here. So turning back to Scotland then, the map on the left shows the approximate maximum extent of the native pine woods, probably about 4,000 years ago. Like we heard in Ireland, they went into decline. The arguments rage about whether it was climate change or people or some combination of the two. The end result is still the same. We've got very little left. The map on the right, the black blobs are the main remnants. There's 34 of them. And then there's a number of smaller ones, in some cases only with 50 trees. And the shaded area on the right is where Trees for Life, the organisation I founded in 1986, has been concentrating its efforts for over 30 years now. So we inherited a landscape mostly bereft of trees. Those remnants consist almost exclusively of old trees. There's essentially been no recruitment for between 150 and 200 years. Since not long after the time of the clearances and the sheep were introduced, deer numbers were allowed to grow to create sporting opportunities for wealthy landowners. And the ecosystem has been so far out of balance that every tree seedling that germinates gets eaten. And you can see the result of that in the middle picture there. Just a few needles left on a pine seedling. And a few months after that photograph was taken, a seedling I've been watching for many years, it was completely dead. And the consequence of that, on the right, you see we've got what I call the geriatric forest. Old trees dying of old age naturally. They're at the end of their lives, and they're not being replaced by anything else. They're at the end of the line. We've got away with it for 200 years because the trees have still been growing. Now they're not. They're at the end of their lives and they're not being replaced. So we're the last generation that can do anything about this. Not just Scots pine, it's the key species, it's the keystone species in the Caledonian forest, the largest and longest lived, but actually it's not the preferred food of deer. If you ever try to eat a pine seedling, it's not very, a pine seed, it's pine needles, they're not very nice. Rowan, by contrast, highly palatable, along with aspen, probably the most palatable of all to deer. And this is a group of rowan seedlings I've been monitoring since 1992. They're in the Upper Afric watershed. There's no mature trees around at all. And you can see when the last photograph was taken in 2015, I'm due to take another one soon, those seedlings were smaller than they were in 1992. Negative net growth in 23 years. And it will only take one deer to be in that area to prevent those trees from growing. There are no mature trees there. We've reduced the vegetation community down to the bare minimum, to grass, because grass is adapted to grazing. Everything else gets eaten and killed. So we've got what I call an outdoor museum landscape. We go to museums to see dead relics of the past, and the landscape in Scotland shows dead relics of the past. You've seen the stumps already. But it doesn't have to be that way. Some people argue that Scotland's natural state is treeless. It's too cold, it's too wet, it's too windy, the soils are too depleted, trees will not grow there. It's not true. 3 years ago, I led a trip for some of the Trees for Life staff to Norway, southwest Norway, further north, colder, wetter, windier, covered in trees. But a century ago, it was as treeless as Scotland. Then the people left voluntarily. In the case of Norway, they weren't evicted. They left and went to Minnesota and places in the States. And because there was no big introduction of sheep and there was no expansion of deer numbers, the forest came back by itself. And you can see the contrast between these two landscapes. So the natural state of affairs in most of the Highlands of Scotland would be trees. And 10,000 years ago, approximately, when the last ice age ended, the landscape was treeless. And the trees got back by themselves. They would do that now if we weren't preventing them. We prevent them by having this imbalance between trees and deer. So if we're looking at restoration then, and I'm talking here about restoration of a whole ecosystem, not just trees, but all the associated species, there's three main elements I think we need to consider. First, we need to have healthy vegetation communities restored instead of the static grassland ecosystem that dominates so much of the highlands today. Secondly, we need to re-establish some of the crucial ecological processes that create dynamism in an ecosystem. Succession, disturbance, predator-prey dynamics, and so forth. And then thirdly, we need to reintroduce species which are either absent or are unable to colonize areas by themselves because they've got limited dispersal abilities. And the aim of my work has always been to return the ecosystem and all its species right up to the top predators, because in my view, we will never have healthy, functioning, long-term, stable ecosystems until we get all their components back in place again. Now, that's obviously quite radical. It may not be something that's entirely feasible in Ireland. People question whether it's feasible in Scotland, but I think if we don't aim for the best, if we don't aim for what's right, we'll never get there. So work has been underway in Scotland for probably 25, 30 years, some places a little bit more, to help restore things, to help bring the forest back. And the best way is natural regeneration. So where there are existing woodland remnants, take measures to reduce this imbalance between deer and tree regeneration to help the trees recover. These are a couple of photographs. I wasn't involved in any of this work, but Glenfeshie on the left is a privately owned estate in the Cairngorms, now owned by a Danish man who has had the courage to drastically reduce deer numbers, and there's phenomenal regeneration of Scots pine occurring, as you can see. On the right, Craigmeggy National Nature Reserve, managed by Scottish Natural Heritage. They've done the same thing, and birch trees are coming away in large numbers by themselves. That's not possible in all places, so my organisation, Trees for Life, has had to rely on fencing because we couldn't get landowner agreement for various reasons to reduce deer numbers. So the fences keep the deer out. No prizes for guessing who that rather hairy-looking young man is on the left there. That was the first project. That photograph was taken in 1992, 2 years after the fence went up, and you can see a young pine seedling there just sticking its nose above the blaeberries. And the photograph on the right, taken about 6 months ago, is the same tree. So all we've done there is keep the deer out. Now, there are arguments that keeping all large herbivores out is not an ideal solution. I agree with that, but it's an emergency measure, and we'll give it another 5 years or so. The fence will come down, reduce numbers of deer, hopefully. We'll come back in, and we'll get that presence of low-level grazing again. But the crucial thing is we've got to get the vegetation recovery underway. And some of the results can be quite dramatic. This is another set of before and after photographs, the same area, not showing the fence line. On the left, taken in 1989, before it was fenced, 3 dead standing Scots pines, showing the decline of the forest, its disappearance. But there were enough trees there in the background as a seed source, and you can see in the photograph on the right, after 25 years of protection, all those pine trees have grown by themselves. No need to plant them, they just come back spontaneously. The seedlings were already there. So that's natural regeneration, the best way, but that only works if you've got a seed source nearby. Most of the highlands, that's not the case. So we've been planting trees. Started that in 1991. The top left photograph was from our very first ever tree planting week, and I believe there is somebody in the audience today who took part in that, Paddy Purser, whose name was mentioned this morning. So it's great to have somebody here who was part of that program. And you can see we were planting trees in an area where there were stumps of the vanished forest. But look at the difference between the top photograph on the left and the one below it, taken about 11 years later, or 12 years later. Not just the trees have grown, but look at how the roots of the stump in the top picture have become covered by heather. Because the deer before were not just eating any tree seedlings, they were eating the heather, they were eating everything down to about 1 inch in size. And now, after another decade or so, the picture in the bottom right, the stump is virtually invisible because the heather and other understory plants have grown up all around it. So you can see that actually planting trees and having to do it inside a fence here to keep the deer out allows all the vegetation to recover. This is the more dramatic example of the same area. This shows the fence line, some of the Scots pines here that were planted. And look at this, what I call the wild garden inside here. You've got heather flowering. The plant on the left and the sort of lower left is bog myrtle, which is an aromatic shrub. And like alder, it's a nitrogen fixer. It has bacteria in its roots, and it typically grows in wet areas. It improves the soil in those leached acidic conditions. And if you look outside the fence, you can see what we call peat hags, those areas where the peat has been eroded by the weather, by elements, by water and so forth. There's bare, naked peat there, and those are like running sores in the land. They shouldn't be there. And when the browsing pressure is reduced, they actually revegetate as well. So you get this dramatic transformation when the grazing pressure is eliminated by the large herbivores here. And these two pictures show that. The one on the left, the fence there, on one side you can see there's lots of heather in bloom. There's birch trees that have regenerated naturally, pines on the skyline that were planted, and outside is just grass and a few stumps. Picture on the right, even more dramatic. This is a small area of stock fencing put up by some volunteers around an eared willow plant that we found struggling to survive in the Upper Afric watershed. And we put the fence up to help the willow grow, and remarkably, after 7 years of protection, bluebells appeared there. Now, what's special about that is that those bluebells are at least 20 kilometers away from the nearest population of bluebells that exist. How did they get there? We don't know. But in the protection of that little fence, there's now over 100 bluebell plants flowering, as well as other plants like St. John's wort and so forth. So even in these barren areas, in remote places where it's just grass, there is still a seed bank in the soil. Seeds are still arriving, and nature will recover when we give her a chance. So succession then is one of the key things to get established, to get away from the static museum landscape dominated just by grass. If you put up a fence on the left here, you can see the brown there is heather coming in. So the grassland gives way to heathland, and then in the heathland you get the pioneer tree species coming, the birches, the rowans, the willows and so forth, you see on the right. You begin to get this recovery process underway. And once the vegetation recovers, you get insect life in particular rapidly appears. Insects that can fly will get there under their own steam, and they feed on the vegetation, and they in turn attract insectivorous birds. In this case, a crested tit, one of the 3 characteristic species of the Caledonian forest. And even the peat hags revegetate over time. On the left here, you can see what this landscape looks like. It's a very sad and depressing place to be in. But the picture on the right, after 20 years of a fence there, you can see there's a little bit of wood visible, but plants have begun to colonize even the bare peat. Anybody who's a gardener knows, this time of year, things are beginning to get growing. You weed your garden, and what happens? Well, more weeds grow. The earth always wants to be green. It's unnatural to have bare earth anywhere. That's a sign that things are way out of balance. We also do work on clearing non-native species. Rhododendron's been referred to earlier today. It's a huge problem in some areas, particularly in the west coast of Scotland, so there's now major funding available to tackle it. In this particular case here on the left, glyphosate was injected into the stems of the trees, of the rhododendrons, to kill them, and then the wood was cut down. Some was used for wood stoves, but the smaller stuff was just burned on site to clear it. And then follow-up work needs to be done afterwards for any resprouting that occurs. But that seems to be one effective way of treating the problem. So moving on then, we need to then think about some of the species that are missing, helping them to get back. So in Scotland, we've now got 2 of our former large mammal species re-established. The beaver, after over 20 years and £2 million of government expenditure and a trial that lasted 5 years, we've finally got the beaver accepted as a legitimate native species in Scotland. And that's a crucial step, because up till then, all reintroduction efforts have been focused on birds. We have things like the sea eagle and the red kite reintroduced, the ospreys that came back by themselves, but actually getting a mammal back as a deliberate reintroduction effort is quite a breakthrough. So we've got beavers back, although they're quite restricted at the moment, but over time they're going to spread. And we've also got wild boar. And again, that's a bit of a sort of unplanned venture. People have had boar in farms and they've escaped, or they've perhaps been deliberately released in some places. There's at least one Highland estate where boar were kept in captivity, and they now advertise sport shooting of wild boar. That was only the last technical hitch. Okay, we'll continue with this one. I trust everybody can hear me and again now. So what happens when we start putting things back in place in an ecosystem is the web of life begins to reweave itself. you get these unexpected surprises that occur. On the left here, this is the sucker of an aspen tree. And aspen's one species that Trees for Life has a particular interest in because it hardly ever flowers and very rarely seeds. And because of that, when it's removed from an area, it will never get back. So we've been mapping out where aspen is. We've been protecting existing aspen stands with fences, and we've been propagating it from root sections. This particular thing here is a sucker. That's a shoot growing off the root of a parent aspen tree. They'll grow up to 50 meters from a parent tree, and they stay connected through the root system to the original trunk. So an actual stand of aspen might have 10 or 12 stems to it. It's one organism, not 10 or 12. They're all connected. So we protected an aspen sucker here with some net lawn fencing, and it grew 4 feet in 10 weeks. That's a tropical rate of growth. And the reason it can do that is it's not a seedling with a tiny root system. It's a sucker growing off the root system of a big tree. So they grow very quickly. But what was more remarkable was that in those 10 weeks, it created the habitat for 2 species of invertebrates. There are aphids on there, Pterocoma tremuli, specific to aspen. They suck the sap of the aspen and they secrete honeydew. And the honeydew is the primary food source for wood ants, Formica lugubris in this case. And wood ants are a keystone species in forest ecosystems. So the simple act of protecting one aspen sucker enabled 2 invertebrate species to thrive in a new habitat. Picture on the right, perhaps even more dramatic. These are boar we had on the Trees for Life estate at Dundragon. We got them from a Highland Wildlife Park who didn't want them anymore. And the winter we got them was very cold. And snow appeared winter of 2009, 2010. I don't know what it was like in Ireland. Anyway, within 24 hours of getting the boar, we began to notice robins following them around. Now, this is behavior that's well known in continental Europe where boar have never been eliminated. Robins look for disturbed ground to find worms and grubs and so forth. And in Britain, in the absence of boar, they've adapted to substitutes, people, gardeners specifically. So if you go out to dig your garden in the spring, the robins will come very quickly to look for worms. So they have long ecological memory. So within 24 hours of having the boar back on this piece of land in Scotland, the robins were following them around. And you can see how close they got in the snowy conditions. They were desperate. So these are what are called positive trophic cascades, where you get something that happens on one level in an ecosystem and it ripples down and affects other levels. And there's a really good example of that being documented in Ireland, which I'm sure many people in this room have heard about. And that is that the return of pine martens and their spread has had an impact on the distribution of squirrels. And we heard a bit about grey squirrels earlier. And it's now been documented in Ireland, and it's been replicated by the same student in Scotland, that when pine martens become re-established, grey squirrels go into retreat, and reds are able to colonize the territory. Now, the reason it's thought this is the case is that grey squirrels come from eastern North America, where there is no mustelid equivalent carnivore to pine martens. Grey squirrels are larger than reds, and they spend more time on the ground, and they're vulnerable, so they move out of the way. And that creates opportunities for the reds to expand their range again. And red squirrels, lighter, more agile, they go out to the tips of the branches of trees like Scots pine, where the pine martens can't reach them. The martens get some red squirrels, but they have an ecological balance. They've co-evolved together, which grey squirrels haven't. Very interesting. I think there's a lot more we can do along those lines to look at how we help accelerate the process of recovery of ecosystems. We're also doing work to help red squirrels recolonize areas where they can't reach by themselves. They will not spread across large areas of open treeless ground. So we're translocating them from areas where they're abundant to isolated woodlands where they're missing squirrels. And there's a lot of attention now on the need to reintroduce carnivores to bring back the balance in the ecosystem. So the lynx is the primary candidate for that. So I'm just going to wrap up very quickly with a summary of the principles we use to guide our work. They're all based on the premise that nature knows best. So you work from areas of strength where the ecosystem is in its best condition, closest to natural. Pay attention to keystone species, Scots pine, beavers, wood ants, so forth. Re-establish ecological processes like succession, nutrient cycling. Mimic nature wherever possible. So we plant in irregular patterns. Recreate ecological niches where they've been lost. Re-establish ecological linkages, reconnecting things in the web of life. Control and or remove introduced non-natives. Remove or mitigate the limiting factors that prevent restoration occurring naturally. In our case, that's the imbalance between large herbivores and vegetation recruitment. Pay special attention to species with limited ability to disperse. Aspen, wood ants, twin flower, another species that's very rare in Scotland but very abundant elsewhere in its circumboreal range. Reintroduce species that can't get back by themselves. Re-establish ecological processes, particularly things like predator-prey dynamics and disturbance. There was a discussion earlier about deer, and we've done some experimental work on using people walking through a forest at night to disturb deer at this time of year when the leaves are flushing, and that's when they're really vulnerable, to replicate the effect of the missing predators that are only successful in 10% of their kill attempts. The other 90%, they disturb the deer and move them on. That's a function that's missing at the moment in most places. Let nature do most of the work. And love, the quality of how we work, not just what we do, has a very tangible effect on everything that we direct it to, what I call the green thumb principle. And we've seen that really in our work in Scotland. So these are some of the key qualities that people receive from engaging in restoration work. I don't think I've got time to go through them all there, but some of the most important things that we need in our human lives for our own health, qualities of healing, empowerment, connecting with nature, come when we engage in this process. So taking part in restoration work has deeply transformative effects. It changes people's lives. It is a labor of love. It's not driven by economics or anything else. It's driven by wanting to reconnect with nature and bring that into the forefront of our lives again. And that is the hope for the future. I believe, going back to the picture of the Earth from space that we started with, that the time is ripe for the first shared task for all humanity. We've never had a common goal that unites all peoples, all nations. Surely it has to be helping our planet to recover from its present crisis, bringing back life and diversity. And we know it's possible. Nature has tremendous healing abilities, and when we actively assist it with the power of our hands and our hearts, we can accelerate it. We literally hold the future of the planet in our hands. I want to finish then with two pictures of hope. The one on the left is trees that were planted, some of them by people in the room, in 1991, growing healthily in Scotland in what was a treeless landscape. The other is a young rowan from Killarney. And rowan is a tree that's very palatable to deer. The fact that it's growing there is a positive sign. Thank you very much.